part 3. Alright, so what I do now is I have my bezels all set up how I need them to be. I put down something called a fire coat, which is denatured alcohol, and something called magic flame, which is essentially borax. So it just helps with fire scale, especially when you're working on silver. So I've kind of heated everything up just to kind of like get that coat on there good. Next I'm going to do is actually flux. So I use a flux from Hoover and Strong. It's a delightful flux. It's called Free Flow Flux. So it's the hippies of the flux. It's my preferred over any of the fluxes, really. So as you notice, I put on flux hot, or at least the metal warmed some. It tends to stay in place, and actually you don't tend to use as much. So it's just something I prefer to do. They call it hot fluxing. I used to cold flux pretty much all the time beforehand, before I came and did jewelry school out here, and you know, changed my whole life. So it's just something that I think works. So I get everything good and fluxed. I have my actual solder. I do what they call pick soldering, so I tend to pick up and place it for most things. When I'm putting things on a back plate, I tend to not do it that way and just pick up solid pieces and place them. So I'm taking the solid pieces and I'm placing them probably every like 7-8 millimeters on the interior. And so I've got them cut. I buy wire solder. I use medium for this stage because I've used hard to solder the bezel together. So almost all of the next things that I do are done with medium. So I'll use medium for like the next 2 or 3 kind of procedures. And then I'll move to easy if there's one last little doodad I'm going to add to it or something like that. I'm going to do the shank. This is going to be a ring. And I'm going to do the shank. I'll solder the shank together with hard, but then I'll solder it on with medium. These bezels won't come off because I'll have them in a manner protected that they won't. Plus, you do have about 75 degrees difference when you're soldering something on. So each time you heat something up, solder will not melt at the same temperature anymore. So each time you go to solder, it gets higher and higher temperature, but it usually only raises I don't know, like 50, 75 degrees at a time. I don't know the exact number that it does, but that's the reasoning. So now what I'm doing is just kind of, since it's silver, I'm dancing the heat in circles around. And so what you look for is, you know, that glassy look to the flux. Any flux that kind of tends to dance or anything like that. In the heating process, I tend to kind of push it to the edge of the bezel, of the inside of the bezel, because if it moves, it's just going to flow. If it's not at a seam, it's usually not going to do anything but puddle. The reason we put the solder at the seam is because there's something called capillary action. So you think of like tiny capillaries in your body. It's the same thing with solder. So it goes where this heat is, and it's going to be the hottest at the 2 points that are touching. So in this instance in particular, I'm you got to heat up the whole piece because we are working with silver. Trying not to stay on top of a bezel edge, because if you do that, you're going to melt the bezel itself. I'm trying to solder this to an 18 gauge piece of metal, and that tends to be a little bit more difficult because it's harder to get that back plate hot enough to solder. So here I go. I'm doing a lot of the outside. I might come in a little on the inside, but kind of keep this dancing. You'll start to notice when it's getting hot enough. Well, you've soldered things together, so I know you've done this, but the key in this kind of instance is kind of being able to watch your solder go along this seam, creating this capillary action. So as I'm going here, I'm still heating. I'm going to turn up my torch just a smidge, pull in the oxygen a little bit more. Okay, the flux is kind of getting to the end of its life. In other words, my flux in particular tends to turn greenish red when their solder is flowing. So what I'm getting is what they call the capillary action. So the join of the two are going around the whole bottom edge of the bezel. Okay, so I'm getting that metal hot enough again. Here the other bezel goes real smooth. You just make sure you've got a nice solder seam, and then you pull away your torch. Okay, and so I know you're still probably using that big torch you were, which is fine. Many people use that, and that's all they use because it's a torch that doesn't require you to have as much tanks and gas in your house. So now that it's soldered, obviously we pickle, but essentially what you kind of want to make sure is you're heating the whole piece, especially even with brass and silver. You want to heat up the whole piece versus concentrating any flame on that bezel, because the bezel wire is usually thinner and will melt quicker. So you want to avoid it. Otherwise, we'll have some disappointing work ahead. So that's it for now. I think, as far as things go from here, you can figure out everything else. Hopefully this helped and that you learned something at Witada Jewelry School. I miss you and hope everything's okay. Ask me anytime for help. I don't mind. Bye.